Hi there. Welcome back. This is the first of the recorded lectures that I'm doing for Borders. I'm going to pick up where we left off on Tuesday. I'm going to give just a very, very brief overview of what we talked about on Tuesday as a refresher, and then I'm going to go into a bit more detail about Thomas Nail's theory of Kainopower. So I'm going to introduce some of the key types of borders that Nail talks about. And then in the next set of lectures, I'm going to go into more detail about the history of those different types of borders and why that history matters. So just a reminder, we went over this on Tuesday, but to remind you again, Thomas Nail tells us that the border is a process of social division. And he also gives us a nice, interesting bit about the etymology of the English word border, which is a really old word. There has been a word for border meaning roughly the same thing for many, 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 many years. It comes from the Proto-Indo-European word, which is very old, berth, which means to cut, split, or divide. So just a reminder, we went over this before. The border is many things. It's a bit abstract, but number one, the border is in between. The border is in motion. The border is a process of circulation. So remember, we talk about how the border creates movement within and outside of it and across it. And this is really key. It's really important. It's also the most difficult to understand. The border is not reducible to space. It doesn't exist simply in space. So really simply what Nail tells us is the border does two things. It bifurcates, i.e. the border cuts up space, and it circulates. It makes stuff move around. So if you remember in our session on Tuesday, the first thing I asked you was, what is a border? The first thing that pops into your head. A lot of you wrote accurately and correctly, it's a division or a separation or a barrier. That is the border bifurcating. But what Nail talks about is actually that bifurcation does something really important. It circulates, it facilitates movement. Nail introduces this word Kainopower. It's a bit of a jargony word. Don't worry too much about it, but essentially what he means is Kainopower is the theory and analysis of social motion, or the politics of movement. So you may have heard the term biopower, which comes from Foucault. We'll be reading some Foucault in a couple of weeks. Thomas Nail takes this framing of power, and he talks about how movement and motion are also powerful, how there's also a politics to movement, and he calls this Kainopower. He says really importantly, and this is a kind of foundational point here, that societies are always in motion. So people and objects are always moving around, right? A kind of commodified, commodity-based economy requires objects to move. They go from hand to hand to hand as they get purchased or passed on. People are always in motion. We move throughout our daily lives. We move from home to work to social settings. We migrate long term. We go on holiday short term. We're always in motion. There's also at a larger scale the expansion of territory. So the idea that a particular nation state will move across space, it expands or it shrinks. And economic power also moves. So we have capital moving, and we have spaces or places or individuals or institutions or corporations where economic power sits for a while and then it transitions somewhere else. Power is always in motion. And remember, we talked about this on Tuesday. We have a terminology issue in border studies when we start to talk about all the different ways that borders facilitate movement, because the border facilitates movement in so many different ways. So we need to be really careful and specific about the kinds of borders we're talking about and the kinds of movement that we're talking about. So we're going to talk about terminology a lot, and this is really quite theoretical, but hopefully all of these terms will come back to haunt you in a good way as we move through the case studies on the course. The first type of border that Nail talks about, this is the oldest type of border, and I think it's really important that I specify here that these types of borders move in chronological order. So Nail identifies early prehistoric types of borders and then moves through to very contemporary and modern forms of borders. So the first type is the mark. And this is probably the most abstract of Nail's types of borders because we don't think of this as a border. So the mark is just that. It's a physical mark on the earth. And the mark represents a point of interest, and specifically that Nail says it's a place to return to. So it identifies either home or a site of pilgrimage, a place where people will come back to. So often this is a sacred site, a grave site or a site of ritual or a site of a deity in an animist tradition. And if we think about movement around a region as a social flow, Nail tells us that a mark introduces an inclination. It introduces a sort of desire for us to return to a particular place habitually, a place to come back to for a social or a political reason. And for this reason, the mark is really significant. So Nail tells us that the mark creates a bifurcation, remember a cut or a division, in a continuous flow by introducing an inclination into the flow of people. So in order to return to the mark, the social flow marches. So the social flow kind of marches on, like quite literally. Think about like soldiers marching. So the mark also creates a particular kind of movement. And he says, think of the mark like a kind of division. A symbol carved in a tree, a chiseled rock, a dammed river, a sign made of felled wood inserted into the earth. It marks a memory or trace in the earth through violence. So a memory of a person carving a symbol into the earth, or a memory of a person being buried in the earth, so that it may march out and back around itself. So if you think of marching, and like soldiers marking, then the mark is an offensive border. And this becomes really important when we talk about borders as military points or military marks. And sometimes there are a series of distinct marks that are connected somehow. So if you think of points along a route, for example, kind of way markers along a route, they're marks in the ground that are connected that create an inclination for you to follow the route. For example, if you're following a trail on a hike. The next type of border is the limit. And the limit isn't just the outermost reaches of possibility. So I've sort of used outer space, kind of celestial bodies as a metaphor or a symbol to help you remember the limit. But this isn't the only way that Nail defines the limit. Simply making a mark isn't enough to create a border. The mark has to be defended. It has to be returned to over and over again because it has to be made meaningful or significant. So the limit is the entire line along which the route to the mark is reified or remade. Think of it like the final line along which a border can be defended. So the limit is the path or track left behind by the mark. Making a mark isn't sufficient to constitute a border. The border also requires that the path or track be protected, defended, and enforced. So the limit essentially is the furthest distance away from the mark you can get while still defending the mark. The boundary is a more intuitive concept. We've all heard of boundaries. We use the term boundary a lot. We use it metaphorically and we use it literally. This is the Hunger Games. You may or may not recognize it. I think it's quite an interesting representation of a boundary. If you're not familiar with the Hunger Games, it's fine. I wouldn't necessarily recommend watching them or reading the books, but it's quite a useful concept here for us. So the Hunger Games takes place in an arena in which children fight to the death. Delightful. And the arena itself has boundaries, and the boundaries of the arena are extremely important. For one, they're super dangerous, but they also determine the shape, scope, and size of the playing area. You can also see clearly in this image the people who are within the boundary and who are outside of the boundary. And in this case, it's really important that the people outside of the boundary are controlling what happens inside the boundary. A political relationship is created here. So Nail tells us about the boundary. He says the boundary binds or compels part of the outside to the inside, right? Forces children inside until they kill each other. The boundary is the process that recirculates or bends back into social circulation. So essentially, you hit the boundary and you keep walking alongside it, and you keep walking and 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 walking, and you stay inside, right? So the boundary recirculates, it bends you back into the center. So to be bound is to be in the continual process of being socially recirculated and directed. The boundary brings the social flow in, right? So it brings things from the outside in. So to use the Hunger Games analogy or metaphor or example, the capital brings children in to the center, and then it puts them inside an arena, and it compels and circulates them inside. The boundary is, and this is not relevant for the Hunger Games, the boundary is inclusive. It brings together and it joins together. The frontier, my personal favorite. I'm from the frontier, an extremely violent type of border. It comes back to haunt us across all of our sessions this semester. Check out the image. This is a painting by Nathaniel Curry of the American Frontier, an American artist. In the foreground, you can see civilization, right? It's a representation of civilization. There's a train heading towards empty wilderness, right? So the train is stopped here in this bit of civilization and it's heading out into empty wilderness, presumably to settle. Notice as well, there's indigenous people on the right, right? So a very kind of white colonial racist representation of indigenous peoples on the right, and white settlers on the left. And the west, which is the kind of horizon, is empty. It's key that it's empty. The frontier is the foremost part of the border. So it's kind of the very ends. It's a little bit like the limit. The frontier expels and disjoins from the social flow. And the frontier functions as a kind of zone, which means that it's always undergoing change. So remember, we talked on Tuesday about how borders are always kind of moving. The frontier in particular is a very movable border, and in fact, at its very heart is the assumption of movement and change. The frontier is exclusive, and the frontier is defensive. And it's really important. So if you go back to the previous slide and you look at that image of a kind of mythical white settler representation of the West, what's really important is that the mythology of the frontier as being empty justifies in white settler minds the idea of closing or moving into the frontier, because it allows for the actual expulsion of native peoples who are already living there. So if you pretend like you're not expelling anyone, you can claim the territory and land and resources as your own, when in fact what you're actually doing is forcing outwards, pushing outwards the people who already live there, because they're not brought in to the new nation, they're expelled outside of it, right? They're not included or incorporated into a new white United States. They're pushed further out. The fence. This is the fourth type of border. This is from an Australian film, Rabbit Proof Fence, which is about Aboriginal children traveling across the bush in an attempt to escape from reservation life. They travel across and follow a fence. The fence is first and foremost a striker cut into the earth. So you remember the mark. So a fence begins with a mark, but it's many, many marks. And it starts with a pit, a hole specifically. So you have to dig a hole in order to stick your fence post in. Second, the fence adds something to the cut or hole to create a verticality rising above the earth, the pile. So it goes down into the earth and upwards into the sky. And that three-dimensional aspect of the fence is extremely important, especially when you're talking about contemporary walling practices, which of course most famously currently happening on the US-Mexico border, but also extremely relevant if we are to think about, for example, the security barrier in Israel and Palestine. The fence produces the first architectural function of the border, which is separation. So some of you identified separation as one of the key features of a border on Tuesday, and you're absolutely right. And the fence is the first architectural form that acts as a separation barrier. The wall. Sam was drawing the Great Wall of China on Tuesday on our whiteboard. This is it. This is the wall. Technically, we learned from Wikipedia that the Great Wall of China is actually a number of different walls. The wall is where it gets political. So a fence might divide two pieces of territory where there isn't a particular political relationship, but the wall is a political organization of fences under a military or government power. So this is what differentiates a wall from a fence. So to go back to Israel and Palestine, if you think about that particular example, there's real debate and disagreement over the terminology used to describe the types of barriers that are in existence in Israel and Palestine, right? Some people call it a separation barrier. Some people call it a security fence. Some people call it a wall, right? And it's really, really important who's using which terminology, because which term you use determines what you think the purpose of the barrier is, right? And that is fundamentally political. So where the fence is about separation of land into territory, so the fence kind of separates out, this is, farmer A owns whatever, farmer B owns whatever else, right? The wall is also about defending the territory and the creation of political life. So it is also about thinking about who belongs on which side of the wall. So we start to see ideas of belonging, not citizenship in the way that we might think of now, but certainly political subjectivities, right? So the wall facilitates the creation of political life. The cell is really important, and the cell absolutely will come back to haunt you when we talk about Foucault. The cell is extremely important when we talk about discipline, when we talk about punishment, when we talk about individual bodies. The cell historically is one of the most important bits of architectural invention. It's absolutely fundamentally important when we talk about European and North American civilization. Nail reminds us that the cell divides human life into individual lives. So the cell constructs an enclosure which is designed to surround, confine, and contain individual people. So individual bodies and individual cells, right? And it's not just in sort of Christian terminology, it's not just an individual body, it's also an individual soul contained within a cell. And once an enclosure contains separate individuals, linkage is able to bring them together without unifying or homogenizing them. So if you think about monks in a monastery, each monk has their own individual cell, but they're brought together as individuals, as members who are members of a religious community. You could also apply this in other contexts. The last type of border, and this is the border that we'll come back to at the very end of the course when we talk about European borders, is the checkpoint. This is Checkpoint Charlie. This photo was taken from 1961. This is a very famous piece of the archive, the Cold War archive. Checkpoint Charlie is in Berlin. If you've been to Berlin, you may have seen the U.S. Army checkpoint memorial that's still there. And Nail says the checkpoint border is extremely important and it's really unique. The checkpoint border takes place at any point whatsoever. The checkpoint border is a concrete point where the subject comes under formal inspection and division by a border authority. The key point about the checkpoint is that it can happen at any time, it can be dismantled and set up somewhere else. So if you think about movies or TV shows that show a police checkpoint on a road, for example, they're temporary. They pop up where necessary and then they are taken down when they're no longer needed. The checkpoint border is really important for thinking about the contemporary world that we live in. You know, we live in a checkpoint society now. So we'll come back to this particular border in a number of weeks. We'll talk about it a little bit every week, but for the most part, we save this for the end. So you don't need to totally understand the checkpoint border. We will talk about it in far more detail in weeks 8 and 9. That's it for this set of slides. I'm going to go into far more detail about all of these types of borders and specifically the history behind them. History is extremely important, and I will try and convince you in my next recorded set of slides why history is important. And until then, have a look at some of the other materials. Get to reading, have a look at Neil's introduction if you haven't looked at it yet. More soon. Bye-bye.